So with that bodhicitta in our hearts, then we can do the verse of refuge from bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Well, good to see everybody. Let's see. Maybe first I'll just double check. We're going to pick up where we left off, but I want to make one point related to last. Maybe I'll first ask: does anybody have any questions from last time that are sort of burning? You don't want to leave behind, or
one.
Oh, go ahead.
I know you guys are working on the website. Do you know if it's going to be posted sometime soon?
Gabe could answer that because he's doing the website.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty much ready. So I'll be sending Lauren and the board the a link for them to kind of review it first, and then it'll be ready in a couple of days. Once they're done reviewing it, then it'll be ready for it'll be good to go. It's pretty much ready. They just have to send it to the board for review.
Well, thanks, Gabe. Gabe's put a lot of work into that. Sorry, it crashed, and Gabe's created a whole new website in the last few weeks. So kind of. Well, maybe, okay, I'm just going to go, before we go on to the next page, I want to go back actually, because I want to raise just one more issue, just to think, and again, a lot of this is, to understand and think about. So last time we talked about, appearing objects, determines objects, and objects of engagement, right? With appearing objects being, what appears to a consciousness, right? And the object of engagement being what that's getting at. And remember, right, so for a conceptual consciousness, the appearing object is a mental image, right? But what's being gotten at is what the mental image is of, right? Whereas for a direct perceiver, for at least for a direct perceiver, that's not a wrong consciousness, right? Then the appearing object and the object of engagement are should be the same. Here's the issue I just want to bring up briefly is where is it? It says here, here, I'm just going to read a sentence from the page 2. It says, this is because whatever is a thing, meaning a functioning thing, is necessarily the appearing object of a direct perceiver. And whatever is permanent is necessarily the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness, right? And what they're getting at there, remember we talked about this last time, is that because an example of a permanent thing is a static mental image, right? Not permanent. And remember, permanent in Buddhism doesn't mean eternal. It means not changing, instant by instant, static, right? So here, I just want to raise the debate point to you all, just to think about. So it says here, right, a functioning thing, meaning something that arose due to causes and conditions. So example would be a tree or a chair or a vase or a cup, right? Or a person. That one actually a body, right? A better way to put it. Those are functioning things that are necessarily objects appearing direct to direct perceivers, whereas permanent, whatever is permanent, right? In this case, they're mainly referring to mental images, is necessarily the appearing object to a conceptual consciousness. Okay, so I said that last time. I just want to raise a topic to contemplate for a second. So that's a tenet of this school, right? We're doing this from the perspective, right, of the Sautrantikas. Here's my debate point just to think about for a second. So Tantrikas teach, right, that there is such a, the five paths, right? So the path of accumulation and preparation and seeing, so that an arhat, for example, would traverse, and a Buddha, a Buddha traverses them on the path to Buddhahood, and an arhat traverses them on the path to arhatship. So, and according to this tenet system, right, and we've said this in tenets actually for those who were in that class, but all Buddhists say, right, when somebody achieves the path of seeing, right, the third of the five paths, we often say, in the Mahayana, we'll say they directly realize emptiness, right? Since this is not a Mahayana tenet system, they would say they directly realize selflessness, right? Selflessness of persons, that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self of persons. Here's my question for you, just to think about. Remember, right, so selflessness is a mere negation, right? The negation of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? A negation is not an impermanent phenomenon. It's not something, a negation is not something that arose due to causes and conditions, right? It's not a functioning thing, like a table, right? The table arose due to somebody putting it together. It's made up of parts, right? It arose due to causes and conditions. But selflessness is not like that, right? Selflessness is primordially true, right? And it's a negation. So here's my question to you. If it's, so if what arises to a direct perceiver is a functioning thing, how does somebody directly realize selflessness then? Selflessness is not a functioning thing. So I'm just raising this as debate, like something to think about, right? Right. So if selflessness is permanent, according to this, you would think, well, wait a second, then it has to be the object of a conceptual consciousness. But on the path of seeing, one is supposed to directly realize selflessness. So how would that work? Does it make sense? These are the kind, and I just want to point out, these are the kind of points that when they say, when in tenets, right, in the monastery, for example, right, this is what they would do, right? So somebody would say this, oh, this is the definition, this is how it functions. And if you were at Sarah, or this is where this text is from, right, then they would go debate, and somebody would say, well, wait a second, according to your, you just said, right, whatever is a thing is necessary the appearing object of a perceiver, whatever is permanent is necessary the appearing object of conceptual conscious. They would say, therefore, according to you, an arhat on the path of seeing doesn't directly realize selflessness. And they would go like that, right? And then you would have to start debating. And I'm just raising this to think about, right? This is like, because, and part of my point here is that it's to think about these tenets to go, well, so how do they hold this? How do they assert this? And then if you want to think of other tenet systems, you'll be able to kind of do the same process, right? And realize, why is it important to say that, because if somebody were to say, well, can a permanent thing be an object of a direct perceiver? You might think, well, why does that matter? Well, now it's becoming important. If you think about this, right? How do you traverse the path to enlightenment, right? If emptiness and selflessness are both permanent phenomena, in the sense of not changing instant by instant, can they be the objects of a direct perceiver? Sorry, so Lynn, you had a comment.
The last thing you said confused me, but what I was thinking before that was, if you're, and I think you raised this in another context, if you're negating the self or anything that you perceive directly that's seen as permanent, okay, so you say you negate the self, it's derivative, so it can change. It's really not permanent, because when the object that you're perceiving changes, then it changes. So it seems derivative. It's like when you talked about directly realizing emptiness, and it was that's fundamentally different than negating the self to get to selflessness. That's at least the way I understood it. maybe that's wrong, but
That's good. I think what you're getting at is that like there's a basis, right, for selflessness or for emptiness, for both emptiness and selflessness, actually. Right? There's always a base that is empty, right? So like the you know, so for example, you could say you know, the five aggregates. If you're going to say self is the persons, you might say that you could use the example. The five aggregates are empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self persons. And I think what you're getting at, actually, well, I think what you're getting at leads to the. I'll give a partial answer to the question I raised, which is, I want to point this out, like to the difference actually. So according to Prasangika Majjhimikas, it is possible to directly perceive a permanent phenomena, certain permanent phenomena. So Prasangika would say you can directly perceive emptiness, and emptiness would be the only object appearing to that, right? So there's a space-like equipoise, according to the Majjhimikas, where the mind completely absorbs in non-affirming negation, the realization of emptiness. That's a Prasangika tenet. This school would disagree with that. This school says what we just said, right? That direct perceivers perceive functioning phenomena. So according to this school, actually, so what perceives, I want to point out something. First of all, like of direct, we're going to get into this soon, but there are different types of direct perceivers. So the direct perceiver that realizes selflessness is called a yogic direct perceiver. You know, it's not a sensory direct perceiver, it's a yogic direct. Yogic direct perceivers are direct perceivers that arise due to the force of a union of calm abiding and special insight. So anyway, so it would be a yogic direct perceiver. But according to this tenet system, according to Sautrantikas, selflessness, because it's a permanent phenomena, let me go back here, cannot be the appearing object of a direct perceiver, right? Because the appearing object of a direct perceiver is always a functioning thing. So for Sautrantikas, the appearing object to that yogic direct perceiver are the aggregates or the compositional factors, the stuff that make up the aggregates. And what they're seeing, so their direct perception is of compounded things, right? Aggregates. And for them, selflessness is indirectly realized. So in other words, what is directly perceiving in that moment are the five aggregates for them, right? And what they indirectly realize is that those five aggregates, for example, are empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And it's a bit like this. Actually, I just want to give an analogy for a second. It'd be like if somebody were at a zoo and they went around and saw all the animals. And when they finished the circuit of the zoo, it was, let's say, a small zoo, right? They finished the circuit of the zoo and they realized after seeing the zebras and the gazelles and the whatever, lions, they said, they turned to their friend, they said, wow, there was no elephant there, right? My point is that they perceived a bunch of animals and they realized there was no elephant among them, right? I'm just giving an analysis, a silly, simple, and simplistic analogy. But this yogic direct perceiver directly perceive what it's directly perceiving are functioning things, and what it's realizing is there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self there. So that's how that works. I just wanted to point. So, and the reason why I'm just pointing out, one is I'm pointing out that's how this works in this system. But do you see the implication actually? Like, in other words, that according to this school, if you were to realize selflessness according to this school, the experience would be not a space-like equipoise, right? That's described in the Majjhimika. The experience would be of momentarily impermanent phenomena, right? That are changing instant by instant, seen by a yogic direct perceiver in meditation. And there will be this powerful transformative realization that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self there in those. Right? That would be that person's experience. Whereas for a Majjhimika, right, the experience is when a Majamaka experiences emptiness directly, right? It's a direct perception of a permanent phenomena, according to permanent, not in the sense of eternal, but permanent in the sense it's not changing instant by instant, right? It's mere emptiness, right? And there are no conventional, right? So according to this school, you would still be seeing conventionally, I mean, what Majamakas would call conventional existent phenomena. This school doesn't call them conventionally existent. This school would say conventionally existent phenomena are concepts. But anyway, so according to my point is though, according to Majamaka, it will be a space-like equipoise, right? A mere negation with an experience of the mind in a space, in a state, space-like in the sense that it's a mere negation. It's not spaced out and it's not a mind absorbed in space, right? It's a mind absorbed in emptiness, but they say it's like water poured into water, this experience of complete absorption in emptiness. This school's view of selflessness meditation is not the same. Does that make sense? And does that make sense? Why, right? Because this school is saying direct perceivers perceive impermanent functioning things. That means that kind of yogic direct perceiver has to perceive impermanent functioning things, meaning aggregates, right? Or compounded stuff that makes up the basis of designation of a person, right? And they realize there's no self there. Okay, I just wanted to point that out because that's an implication of what we covered last time, and it's a real. And the reason why I'm pointing out is not just it's probably the most important implication, right? Because it's an implication that has to do with meditative experience. So then we'll go ahead. So we finished last time, and that was just an implication of it. What was called objects. So the text, the next part 2 of the text is called object possessors. And I was pausing about this, and I think it's a translation of the Tibetan, right? So of object possessors. I think it's a little bit of a strange, in English, it's a kind of strange term, right? Because possess means, like usually we say to own. Some translators use the term subjects. I find that simpler in some ways, but we'll use the language they're using here. But what it's getting at is subject and object, right? So object possessors doesn't mean something that owns an object, right? What it means is a subject, right? One thing you'll obviously, if you think about this, right? So subjects and objects are mutually dependent in a way, right? In other words, a subject perceives or gets at an object, and an object is that which is gotten at by a subject, right? So these two concepts, objects and object possessors, or objects and subjects, are mutually interdependent. So it says here, part 2, object possessors, meaning subjects. With respect to the second, object possessors, there are 2 parts, the definition and the divisions. So first, the definition of something being an object possessor or a subject, a thing that possesses its respective object. Or we could say a thing that gets at its respective object, right? I'm just giving different ways of sort of trying to think about what this means. And then it gives 3 divisions of object possessors, we'll call them now. Persons, awarenesses, and expressive sounds. And as you can probably guess, since we're doing Buddhism, the most important of these 3 is going to be awarenesses, because that's what we're mostly studying. But they're trying to give an exhaustive list of that which gets at its object, or that which possesses its object, or subjects, right? And so it covers the first very quickly, person. By the way, so in this context, person doesn't necessarily mean human. Person means sentient being in this context, right? So a person could be a dog, for example. A person could be a human. A person could be a being in any realm. So it says, with regards to persons, the definition of something's being a person is a being imputed in dependence upon any of the 5 aggregates. Self, I, person, and being are synonymous. An illustration is a being who possesses a basis of one of the 3 realms. So actually, I'll pause there. Why does it say upon any of its 5 aggregates? And one of the reasons for that, just we don't need to go into detail about this, but one of the reasons for that is that formless realm beings are said not to have form, or sometimes they're said not to have form. There are debates about that. But anyway, so they don't necessarily have form, but they're still a being, right? And they still perceive. I would argue also like a being at the moment of death, right? Just maybe an example where certain aggregates are in function. But anyway, do you notice actually? Right. So what's the definition? So first of all, person doesn't necessarily mean human. Secondly, it's interesting, isn't it? A being imputed independence upon, right? So what is a person? That which is imputed, right? And remember, this is like just interesting, isn't it? What is that? Just think about that for a moment. I'm not going to go into too long here, but a being imputed on any of the 5 aggregates. This is not Madhyamaka, right? But already Buddhism is saying, what is a person? It's a person that which is imputed on any of the aggregates, right? It's imputed. It's an imputedly existent phenomena. And why is that a subject, right, or an object possessor? Because persons perceive, right? If I were to say, Varahi saw a car passing by, right? That's a reasonable sentence and a reasonable assertion, right? And Varahi's a person who saw the car, right? Or if I say, he was looking at the website, he was, because he just told us, right? Gabe is a person, right? And so we could say a person is a subject, right? And in that case, the website would be the object, right? So we can say a person is an object possessor, and that's pretty straightforward. So that's one type of object possessor, and that's all the text says about that, because that's pretty straightforward. Now we're going to get into the more. We'll get into this later, but expressive sounds, words also get at objects, right? Or can be a subject that get at an object, right? So that's why expressive sounds, where it says expressive sound, and expressive sound means we'll get into this later, but that means raindrops. The sound of raindrops hitting a puddle is not an expressive sound; it's a sound. But expressive sound in this context means sound that makes meaning, right? So sound that makes meaning is also a subject that gets at an object. So if I say cup, right, it's that cup is getting at an object. So that's another type of object possessor. But then the most important type of object possessors for our study are awarenesses. So it says here, with regard to the second, awareness, there are 2 parts: division, definition, divisions. So definition, the definition of an awareness is a knower. The definition of a consciousness is that which is clear in knowing. And then it says awareness, knower, and consciousness are synonyms. So for our purposes, those are going to be synonyms. I want to pause here just for a moment, right? So, we say knower. Both of the definitions have knower, right? So cognizance or knowingness. This definition, though, it's worth pausing to just think about for a moment. So this definition of consciousness, that which is clear in knowing, is humongously important in all of Buddhism, isn't it? Like and whether you're studying awareness and knowers, or mind and its functions, or you're studying Tantra, or you're studying Mahamudra, or you're studying any of those topics, this definition, that which is clear in knowing, is important. And so actually, and I'll just say briefly, so clear, right, in this context means unobstructed, right? It means that, so it doesn't have color, it doesn't have shape, right? So it's clear in that sense, right? But just to say clear wouldn't be enough, because, for example, on an uncloudy day, the sky is clear, but the sky is not consciousness, right? So it also has to be a knower, right? That which is aware, that which knows an object, right? And do you see the point here? So again, my part of the point here is knowing, right? The definitions are mutually interdependent, aren't they? Right? So in other words, knowing implies an object, and object implies that which is known, right? So these 2 definitions are mutually interdependent. So anyway, I won't go into more detail, but so that's the definition of an awareness. And then it points out there are divisions, and there are going to be a lot of ways of dividing awarenesses, but the most simple is valid cognizers. In this case, pramana, right? That's the way they're translating pramana. Sometimes some translators call them prime cognizers, but I think valid cognizers is good. And then there are non-valid awarenesses. So I'm just going. Yeah. So what is so in our own system? So now in our own system here, that when it says our own system, it's referring to Sautantrikas, right? So in the Sautantrika system, the definition of a valid cognizer is a new, incontrovertible knower. And this is an important definition, right? Because we're studying. I mean, the pramana is quite. This is the root of what we're studying here, and this is the definition of a pramana, meaning a valid cognizer. I'll go ahead and read this description, and then we'll explain it. It says, there is a necessity of expressing the three, new, incontrovertible, and knower, as parts of the definition of a valid cognizer, because new eliminates that subsequent cognizers are valid cognizers. Incontrovertible eliminates that correctly assuming consciousness are valid cognizers, and knower eliminates that the physical sense powers are valid cognizers. So I want to just describe or explain what that's getting at. And we're going to go through, it's interesting. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different types of consciousnesses or awarenesses in this text, and it's starting to raise some of them here. So, okay, so a valid and I want to point out one thing. So valid, remember I said last time that this idea of valid cognizers are extremely important. And I noted that, right, pramana. So valid cognizer is a translation of pramana. And I'm just going to go back for a second to emphasize the importance of this idea of valid cognizer or pramana. So I'm going to quote Dignaga again. Dignaga is like apart from the Buddha himself, he's kind of the great originator of the pramana teachings in Buddhism, teachings on pramana. So his praise of the Buddha, which then Dharmakirti's whole chapter 2 of the Pramanavartika is a commentary to, he starts with a praise. He praises the Buddha. He says, the Buddha is one who has become pramana. One who has become valid, right? Who has become a valid cognizer. Then he goes on. To the one who wishes to benefit migrating beings, to the teacher, the Sugata, right, meaning the one gone to bliss, the protector, I bow down. Right? And so this is important so the teachings on Dignaga and Dharmakirti, and then therefore later Buddhist philosophers, they refer to the Buddha as one who has gone to pramana, or one who has become valid, one who has become, some translators call it become authoritative. But authoritative in this sense doesn't mean an authority. It means one who perceives things as they are, right? So like, who perceives and who never perceives things as they are not, right? Only perceives things as they are. Only perceives things as by way of a new incontrovertible knower, according to this tenet system, right? So in a sense, you could say, that from a Buddhist perspective, what we're trying to become is somebody who perceives things always validly, right? So this definition then becomes quite important, right? This is connected to our path to enlightenment. It's also connected to knowing things as they are, right? Anyway, so this definition then, what is it? According to this tenet system, a new incontrovertible knower. So what is I think it's Purbachok, right? What is he getting at here? He says, why does it have to include the word new? According to this tenet system, it's because subsequent cognizers are not pramana. What is a subsequent, just briefly, this is another type of consciousness, right? Another type of awareness. A subsequent cognizer knows or is aware of that which was known previously. So a subsequent cognizer is a knower that knows something that is aware of something you've already known, right? But according to this tenet system, a pramana is that which knows newly, right? Or newly realizes something. There's a freshness to it, you could say, right? A newness to that awareness. So it has to include new according to this tenet system. Other tenet systems, not all tenets, actually most tenet systems agree on that, but Prasangikas don't. I'll mention that. But so Prasangikas disagree on the word new. They would just say an incontrovertible knower. But most tenet systems agree that it should be a new incontrovertible knower. So again, so new eliminates subsequent cognizers, meaning cognizers that are aware of something already realized. Incontrovertible eliminates that a correctly assuming consciousness is a valid cognizer. And this is important, so we're going to get into this more later, but what is a correctly assuming consciousness? A correctly assuming consciousness is a conceptual consciousness that assumes or believes something that's actually the case, but doesn't know it incontrovertibly. In other words, it's not certain. And so this is a really important distinction that I just want to suggest contemplating for a second, right? What's your own experience? What's the difference between a correctly assuming consciousness and an incontrovertible consciousness? They have a difference of power, right? They have a difference of certainty. You know, and so there are many, and actually it's an interesting thing to contemplate, which we'll get into more later, to subjectively assess when are you assuming to be something that is true, and when do you know it incontrovertibly, right? And all this is pointing out is that a correctly assuming consciousness is not incontrovertible, right? It's based on some, you know, having heard something, maybe thought about it, but not being absolutely certain, right? Not having an absolute, unchallengeable knowing of a certain thing. So they're different. And we'll get into that more because it lists them more later, but I just want to explain what they're getting at here. And then knower eliminates that the physical sense powers are valid cognizers. Because according to this tenet system and all the higher ones than this, physical sense powers are not valid cognizers, right? And what is that saying? That's, just to put it simply, like, it means that a valid cognizer has to be an awareness, right? It can't be, for example, a physical. So physical sense powers are like eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose they're not nose conscious. They're eye, ear, nose. They're you could say like the sensitive part of those organs, right? And those are physical matter. They're not awarenesses, and therefore they're not valid cognizers. Okay, so that's the definition of a valid cognizer, and that's why it has to include those three parts: new, incontrovertible, and knower. Then, when valid cognizers, pramanas, are divided, there are two types: direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. The individual definitions and illustrations and so forth we explain later. But that's important, right? So direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. And you see my point there, though, that I made this last time, that it is possible to have a valid cognizer that's inferential through reasoning. And much of Buddhist practice is developing valid cognizers through reasoning, inferential valid cognizers. That's, according to, you know, what we're getting at here, a fair bit of Buddhist practice is the development of inferential valid cognition. But we're not going to get to that yet. We're not going to get to valid. Now, Purba steps back for a second, and he's not, and I want to notice something here. He's not saying what is a direct valid cognizer. He asks a different question first. He says, what's a direct perceiver? Because you have to know that in order to then get at what's a direct valid cognizer. And he says, the definition of an awareness that is a direct perceiver is a knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. Now, why is that not the definition of a direct valid cognizer? Actually, here, this is already answered, no point, just above. Did anybody notice the answer? So why would a knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken not necessarily be pramana, be valid cognition? Anybody notice?
It's not new.
Yep, exactly. Good job, Jude. Right. In other words, a subsequent cognizer could be free from conceptuality and non-mistaken, but it's not necessarily new. So it's not, so that wouldn't necessarily be, so that's an example of what Jody just said would be an example of a direct perceiver that's free from conceptuality and non-mistaken, but it's not new, so it's not a valid cognizer. It's not a prominent. Then it says, when awarenesses that are direct perceivers are divided, there are 4 types. So sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, self-knowing direct perceivers, which are asserted according to Satantrikas, right? And yogic direct perceivers. So let's first he looks at sense direct perceivers. So I'll just keep going. The definition of a sense direct perceiver is that which is produced in dependence upon its own uncommon empowering condition of physical sense power, and is a knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. So there are a lot of points here to think about. One is, what does free from conceptuality mean, right? Here, what this is getting at, right, is to put it simply, I mean, we could say more about that, but for now, it's enough to remember, to be clear, that free from conceptuality means it doesn't have a mental image, right? That there's no static mental image. There's no mental concept. There's no mental construct. And in this case, sense direct perceiver means, so it says here, right, dependence upon its own uncommon empowering condition of physical sense power, that it knows an object, on a sensory level, without relying upon a mental image, and it's non-mistaken. And actually, and I'll just point out, the reason why non-mistaken is important is not all sense direct perceivers. I'm sorry. For it to be a sense direct perceiver, it has to be non-mistaken. It can't be a wrong consciousness. And what's an example of a wrong consciousness that would be sensory? There are many, right? Like, so if somebody, for example, if somebody has a disease where they see things the wrong color, right? So they give it, if you had, disease where you looked at white snow, but saw it as a different color because it's gray because of a disease or something, then that's a direct, it's a sensory perception, but it's not only not a valid cognizer, it's not a direct, they wouldn't define that as according to this definition, a direct perceiver is non-mistaken, right? So that would be an example of a mistaken sensory experience, so it wouldn't be a direct perceiver because it would be mistaken. So here it has to be free from conceptuality, meaning no mental image. It has to be non-mistaken, meaning there's no, like, there's a term for this, like it's not affected by a temporary cause of error in their sense organs or in your body, some illness or something wrong with your eyes or something wrong with your ears. It can't have that, or it's not a direct perceiver. And I'm going to wait to get into this idea of I'm going to mention what I'm going to talk more about uncommon empowering condition on the next page, so I'll just keep going. I'll come back to that. So there are divisions rather, of direct perceivers. So now we're starting to get into what is a valid cognizer that's direct perceiver, right? So what are the 3 divisions? There are valid cognizers that are sense direct perceivers. Then, as Jody said, there are subsequent cognizers that are sense direct perceivers. And then there's a 3rd type, awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained, that are sense direct perceivers. And that's another type of awareness. What is an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained? We'll get into that more later, but I'll just mention it because I don't like to leave something where it's like, we're using a term and people don't even know what it's saying necessarily. So that's where an object does appear to your senses, but you don't ascertain it. And the definition of not being able to ascertain it is that you wouldn't be able to remember it later or recall it. And a simple example of that, they often get, there are many countless examples of this. I think in this text they give the example, if you were completely absorbed in listening to your favorite piece of music and something passed by your visual consciousness, right? but your mind was so absorbed in the music that you didn't notice. Like, so, as your eyes were open and you might say, oh, did something go by? Right afterwards, but you can't remember what it was. Or another example would be if you were listening to if you were deeply absorbed in a conversation with somebody and somebody else, and then there was a conversation going on at the next table, right? Somewhere. And it was loud enough for you to hear, but you didn't take in what was being said, right? Because you were absorbed in your own conversation. So in other words, those are examples where an object appears, right, to a sensory consciousness, but it's not ascertained, right? It's not taken in, you could say, and therefore you can't process it, you can't remember it, you can't do anything with that data, right? So that would be, and actually, does it make sense though that is a type of direct perception, right? Because it's not, it's free of conceptuality, it's not mistaken, right? It does depend upon its own uncommon empowering condition. For example, your ear heard the sound, but you didn't ascertain it. So that's a different type, but that's different from a valid cognizer or a subsequent cognizer. It's a third category of direct perception. And then it says that those here. The first, so for the first, for example, is the first moment of direct sense direct perceiver apprehending a form, right? So this is an example of a valid cognizer that's a direct perceiver, right? Would be seeing. So the first moment, if you saw actually just happened the other day. So I looked out the window and saw a bird. Right? And the first moment of seeing that bird would be a sense direct perceiver. That's a valid cognizer. The second is, for example, the second moment of sense direct perceiver apprehending a form. So I was kind of interested because it was a bird. I didn't know what kind it was. So I kind of, stood there looking at it, right? That would be, and as I continued to stare at that bird, the next moments of apprehending that would be subsequent cognizers. Then then I just went over this. The third is, for example, a sense direct perceiver apprehending a form in the continuum of a person whose mind is especially attracted to a pleasant sound. Right. So there is that the visual form could appear, but it's not apprehended because their mind is so absorbed in the sound. Then it says when sense direct perceivers are divided another way, there are 5, and this just goes with the 5 senses, right? Sense direct perceivers apprehending forms, sense direct perceivers apprehending sounds, odors, tastes, and tangible objects. Okay, that leads us to the part I wanted to kind of discuss more now. So I'll read this. The definition of a sense direct perceiver apprehending a form is that which is generated in dependence upon its own uncommon empowering condition, the eye sense power, and its observed condition of form, and is a knower free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. And that's the example he's giving. Popochok is giving the example of visual, right? For visual form here, and then he gives the example of sound, and then he says the same thing applies to the other senses, ears, nose, and so on. Okay, so to understand this well, I kind of want to step back for a second. And what is, because to understand this, you have to understand, so first of all, what's an uncommon empowering condition? Right? And what this is getting at is sometimes there are 4 types of conditions listed, sometimes 3, and I think it's more useful to look at it. Different scholars do it different ways. So it's better to do it as 3 for our purposes here. So I want to describe, so what's a condition, first of all? A condition is that which assists something to arise. So yeah, that's the definition actually. And so in these teachings, there are 3 types of conditions worth noting. And 2 of them are mentioned here in this sentence. The third isn't mentioned. So the 3 types of conditions are empowering conditions. These are the technical terms: empowering conditions, observed object conditions, and immediate conditions. And these all apply to direct perceivers, first of all. So I'll go through I'm going to go through observed condition first, because that's the simplest. So the observed condition is the object observed by a direct perceiver itself, right? So, and these are only posited for direct sense and mental perceivers. These are not posited for conceptual consciousnesses. The observed object condition are required, you could say, to exist for sense direct perceivers, which we're talking about, or also mental direct perceivers. There is no observed object condition for a conceptual consciousness. So the observed object condition is the object of perception, right? So and so the example, you know, if well, in my example from a minute ago, the observed object condition of my valid cognizer apprehending yellow bird was a yellow bird. You know, the observed object condition of a person looking at the blue sky is blue sky, right? So for direct perception to occur, there has to be an object, right? And that's the observed object condition. Now, does that make sense? It's the object being observed, which is a condition for the arisal of perception, right? So that term, observed object condition, really makes quite good sense, right? Doesn't it? It's the observed object which serves as a condition for perception or for cognition. Then the empowering condition. And so the empowering condition it comes from the side of the subject, which is what we're talking about now mostly, right? And so the reason why they say here in this sentence, they say uncommon empowering condition. So what they actually, according to this teaching, what they say is there's a common empowering condition, which is awareness itself. I'm sorry, which is the mental sense power. Actually, that's a better way to put it. It's not awareness. Yeah, well, that is awareness actually, but the technical way they phrase it is the mental sense power is the common empowering condition. The uncommon empowering condition are the various other sense powers. So the eye sense power in this, if it's a visual, and why uncommon? Because for a visual perception to take place, the uncommon empowering condition, or the unique, you could say, empowering condition, is the visual sense power. If it's an auditory perception, then the uncommon empowering condition would be the ear sense power. If it were an olfactory perception, then the uncommon empowering condition of that would be the nose sense power, and so on, right? And tactile for touch. And so actually a sense power, I just want to point this out, sense powers, according to Buddhism, are not awarenesses. They're part of our organs that are required for that type of perception to take place. Right there, and they call it, in Buddhism they call them, I often think this is interesting if you think of it from a perspective of 2,500 years ago, right? They say it's a subtle form of matter inside the organ which allows for perception to take place. So that would be kind of how they describe what is a sense power, right? So a sense power is something physical. It's not an awareness, but it's required, right? You have to have a functioning sense power, functioning eye sense power to give rise to visual perception. You know, and so, and they, you know, obviously, like for example, a person who's blind, let's say, doesn't have a functioning sense eye sense power. So even though they have a mental awareness, in the absence of that type of sense power, they won't give rise to a visual awareness, a visual, visual knowing. So you have to have the common empowering condition being the mental sense power, and then you have, if it's going to be if it's only a mental perception, that's enough, right? It would be the mental, then that would be sufficient. But if it's going to be any of the, as we're talking about here, any of the 5 other senses, then you have to have that uncommon empowering condition, which is the organ, essentially, the sense organ, a functioning sense organ. So you have to have this observed object. You have to have the empowering condition, meaning the sense power. And then you have to have the third type, which is not mentioned in the sentence, but I'll mention it, is the immediate condition. And what's the immediate condition? It's the immediately antecedent or the immediately previous moment of awareness that directly and mainly produces a clear and knowing experience. So it's interesting, isn't it? Like we don't, I just want to pause here. First of all, like we don't usually think this way, but obviously if you think about what this is saying, it makes sense, right? What it's saying is for something as simple as, seeing a pen or a bird or a table, all of this is required, right? The object of perception is required. A functioning sensory organ is required. And awareness is required. Previous antecedent moment of awareness that can give rise to that moment of awareness is required. And when all of those things come together, then there can be a sense direct perception. I'm just good. That's how that's explained. I want to go off just for a moment on a very, I promise it'll be short, but very short tangent here. Do you see how, like, I just think, as I'm thinking about, whenever I think about this kind of topic, I think this is amazing, isn't it? Like in the sense that, sometimes people say, like Mahayana Buddhists say that the teachings, these more fundamental, the teachings of Sautrantika were getting people ready, for the more radical teaching on lack of intrinsic nature, right? Because this is not saying that things lack intrinsic nature. But actually, if you think deeply about this, it's hard to see how could things have intrinsic nature, isn't it? As they say, well, the sense power is intrinsic nature. They don't debate that. They don't raise that as a question. They would say the object. They don't say that the object lacks. But you start to get a sense of, well, wait a second, everything's mutually dependent, isn't it? And for a follower of Sautrantika, that would be so radical that they just stop and they say, yeah, so perceptions arise due to these conditions. Okay. There's no self-sufficient substantiation and self-persons. Good. Let's leave it at that. But if you think deeply enough about these points they're making, this is my personal view here, but it starts to already undermine your sense of things having, we think objects are just objects, right? We think subjects are just subjects. Already this is pointing out, well, wait a second. How do you even define what is a subject? Right? It's interesting. I mean, you define a subject in relation to its object. You define an object in relation to a subject. Right? So I'm just pointing out, like, I think that it's almost like I don't know. I sometimes think it's almost like oh wow, when bad people send like a computer virus or something, like at first it functions within this, at first it seems to function normally, but then it starts undermining your computer. I think the Buddha, this was like a computer virus for grasping at a self of phenomena. And, it's like, it was a gentle beginning where it wouldn't upset people too much and they could meditate on the lack of self of persons. But you start to see how it's already starting to undermine grasping, even at self of phenomena. I think this is my personal view. But actually people have said that. I'm not unique in that, right? Now, other people have pointed that out, that, like they say, why did the Buddha tell them that, that Nagarjuna would bring the Prajnaparamita into prominence in India some centuries later? It was because practitioners had to get you ready. And how are they getting ready? They were practicing Sautrantika. So anyway, so you get the point here. So now we can go back. So where it says a sense direct perceiver apprehending a form, it requires all those phenomena. It requires all those conditions for it to arise. And then you see the same thing applies. Anyway, that's obvious. The same thing applies for the other organs. Then we can go to the mental direct perceivers. With respect to the second, mental direct perceivers, there are two parts, definition and division. So the definition of a mental direct perceiver is that which is generated in dependence upon the mental sense power, is its own uncommon empowering condition, and is a consciousness that is a knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. Right, so one point is the mental direct perceiver. Then for a sense direct perceiver, I just want to point this out, that for a sense direct perceiver, the mental sense power would be considered the common empowering condition, and then the sensory organs sense power would be the uncommon. When it comes to a mental direct perceiver, then the mental conscious is the uncommon empowering condition, right? And empowering just means that it empowers, it allows, right? It serves as the basis, right? It allows that thing to arise, right? So the mental sense power would be the uncommon. And by the way, for the mental sense power, I looked this up because I was making sure I had it right. But the mental sense power, I just want to share that, yeah. For mental perceptions, the immediately preceding condition. So remember I said with other, I mentioned the immediately preceding, the immediate condition was a mental, previous moment of awareness, right? For sensory experiences, the previous moment of mental awareness is the immediate condition and is the common empowering condition. When it's going to be a mental direct perceiver, the immediate condition is the uncommon empowering condition. In other words, the previous moment of mental awareness is the mental it is the mental sense power, right? It's that which allows the next moment of mental awareness to arise. So the previous moment of mental awareness is the uncommon empowering condition in the sense that it allows that next moment of mental awareness to arise. It serves as the cause or the uncommon thing that allows that next moment of mental awareness to happen. And of course, if it's a mental direct perceiver, it's free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. I'll finish this section, then I'll pause to see if there are questions, just because it's explaining what I just said. So divisions of mental direct perceivers are valid cognizers that are mental direct perceivers, subsequent cognizers that are mental direct perceivers, same, and awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained that are mental direct perceivers. Then it says here, the first, a valid cognizer that is a mental direct perceiver is, for example, the first moment of a clairvoyance that knows another's mind. The second, a subsequent cognizer that is a mental direct perceiver is, for example, the second moment of a clairvoyance that knows another's mind. And the third, an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained, is a mental direct perceiver that is, for example, a mental direct perceiver apprehending a sound in the continuum of a person whose mind is especially attracted to a beautiful form. And I want to point out here, so the typical example of mental direct perceive, right? Because usually when we know with our mind, right, typically when we're mentally knowing, often that will be conceptual, right? But this is pointing out there is such a thing as mental direct perception, and an example of that is clairvoyance, right? And I always think that's interesting in these kind of moments, like in these kinds of texts that like they, what's the word we say, right? You know, in a Buddhist text, that's like, just like they're talking about, this is how you see blue, and this is how you hear music. This is how you have clairvoyant experiences. It's no big deal. It's not like some kind of, there's no preface, you know, like if this were, I mean, there's no preface here of like, and by the way, you know, this really can happen, or something. Because in Buddhism, that's considered just normal part of, it's a normal, actually, and you know, you guys, I think we've said this before, but in the Buddhist teachings, right, a clairvoyance that knows another's mind is a natural, it can happen due to the force of karma, right? So some people have that ability due to the force of karma, but the reliable way for that to happen is through calm abiding. In other words, so any person who's developed calm abiding, right, shamatha or shine in Tibetan, a natural effect of having developed calm abiding is clairvoyance. So the saying is any person, and actually that's, according to Buddhism, that's not even a big a deal to develop. You know, develop a calm abiding is like you don't have to be Buddhist to develop calm abiding, right? Buddhists say that many other traditions, certainly many traditions in India, had people who developed calm abiding and therefore clairvoyance, and that was not considered something. That's not, you don't even have to be on the path to enlightenment to develop that. You just have to develop calm abiding. So those are examples of mental direct perceivers. Before we go on to self-knowing direct perceivers, the next classification, we've covered quite a bit so far. Any questions about what we've covered so far? About types of direct perceivers? Frank?
Yes. What is the difference between a sense direct perceiver and a sense consciousness?
Sense direct perceiver. The that's interesting. So the sense, it's interesting actually. So the sense consciousness would be, actually, let's go back. Sense conscious would be that which would be an example, would be a knower, or that which is clear and knowing, right? Because we said earlier, like the definition of a consciousness is that which is clear and knowing. Like, so you would say that the sense consciousness is that which is clear and knowing, whereas a sense direct perceiver, it would be that which depends upon, like, so the sense consciousness would be part of a sense direct perception, you could say. But a sense direct perceiver depends upon the observed object condition, the uncommon empowering condition, and you could say the sense consciousness in order to give rise to that experience. The sense consciousness itself would be, you could say, would be the subject in a way, or the object possessor. But the sense direct perception, or sense direct perception would be that which arises and depends upon that and the other conditions in order to give rise to a specific experience. So so it'll be, so the sense, so sense consciousness would be that which is clear and knowing, which then depends, like in the example of an eye, let's say a visual experience, the sense conscious would be the knower, the object possessor, right? Which then, in dependence upon the object and the eye sense power, gives rise to an experience of sense direct perception.
Thank
Does that
you.
make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, other comments or questions before you?
Hey, Lauren, I got a
Yeah.
question. Can you repeat the explanation of the difference between the common and the uncommon condition? I forget the.
Empowering condition. Yeah. So
Yeah, the
those
empowering.
were so the so for a sense, specifically for a sense direct perceiver. So that's about, if we're talking about a sense direct perceiver, which is what I was talking about then what they say, what I think was Lottie Rinpoche said this in his commentary, that for a sense direct perceiver, the mental sense, I'll actually read the quote, the mental sense power is the common empowering condition. And then the uncommon empowering condition would be, if it were a visual consciousness, it would be this eye sense power. If it were hearing, then it would be the ear sense power. If it were tasting, it would be the tongue sense power. So the common empowering condition for those for sensory experiences is the mental sense power. But then the uncommon one would be the sense power of that organ. And maybe I'll explain actually, just to make it clearer what it's getting at here, Gabe, because this might make it clearer. What it's getting at is this: if you think about, like, actually they say in Buddhism, like in these teachings, in a little more detail, is I'm going to give a mundane example. I'm going to use that same one when I saw the yellow bird the other day. Like, so, like, the window was open. I was upstairs, and like, there was a moment where if I go back and like really look in detail, you'll see this is always there. There was a moment where my mind, right, like I wasn't yet seeing a bird, right, but my mind was looking. Like my mind was saying, "Oh, look," kind of. It was like there was an intent. There was a quality of intention, I guess you could say. In my case, I was sort of wanting to see, because so that was a mental moment, right? Then in dependence upon, that would be the common empowering condition, that mental moment of wanting to look. Then in dependence upon the visual sense power, my actual like eye organ and eye sense power, a visual consciousness arose, right? In dependence upon the bird itself, the uncommon empowering condition of the visual sense power, my eye organ, right? And that common empowering condition, that immediately preceding moment of sort of wanting to see, then I saw a yellow bird, right? So the common empowering condition would be the mind that was open to seeing or wanting to see or intending to see. The uncommon empowering condition, because it was visual, would be the eye sense power, and that would be the difference too. Does that make sense? So one is, the common one would be the mental consciousness, I'll just call it, let's say. The uncommon, because it was a visual, would be the eye sense power. And I'll just keep going for a second here. If I were, let's say, this didn't happen, but I'm just giving a fictional example here. If I were then, let's say, looking at that bird, that would be a subsequent cognition, right? And then if I were to think, oh, I wonder what that bird sounds like, right? And then I were to listen very carefully, right? Then again, the common empowering condition would be the mental, right? Wishing to hear, right? In that case, the mind would be one. And then by listening carefully, let's say this didn't happen, I didn't hear the bird. But if you did, if that were to happen, right? And then let's say I go, oh, wow, that's the song of that bird, and I were to listen. See, it's common because the mental one can precede a visual experience, then can precede a hearing experience, then can precede some other experiences of all different types. Whereas the uncommon, it depends upon that specific senses, sense power and organ. So the mental one is common to all of them, but the uncommon, because if it's going to be a visual, it has to depend on the eye sense power. If it's going to be a sound, it has to depend on the ear sense power, and so on. So that's the difference between the two. Does that make sense? Or is there more questions?
Yeah, no, I was confused between, I thought the common one was the one, basically the sense organ.
No, that's the uncommon.
Okay, so it's backwards. Okay.
Yeah,
I-
oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. You go.
No, I was just confused because I think what I was confused about was when you were talking about the moment preceding, that perception. So I guess that's what I was kind of confused about. But once you said it, it makes sense to me. I probably got to meditate more on it for me to understand it.
I'll share one more thing just about that might help a little too. Is I remember which sutra. It might be the Sutra of Golden Light or the Sangata Sutra. There's one sutra, I can't remember which one, that gives a metaphor for this. And I can't remember which sutra it is, but anyway, the sutra says that the mental, you say mental consciousness or mental sense power is like a person inside a house in this metaphor, and the house has 5 windows of the other senses. And so the metaphor they use is that like the person goes to this window and then to that window and looks out to see different parts of what's happening outside, so to speak. So you could say like the person is a metaphor for the mental sense, consciousness or sense power, which is the common empowering condition. And then each window in that metaphor would be the 5 sense powers, which would be the uncommon, right? So sometimes and the reason why it's uncommon is sometimes the person is looking out this window and sometimes looking out that window, and they can't look out all 5 windows at once. They have to go from room to room to look out the windows or whatever. So like the windows would be like the various 5 sense powers, but the person who's sort of going to each window is the mental mental consciousness, mental awareness. And so that's common to all, because it's the mental consciousness that actually brings its knowing nature to then that sense that then that then becomes the empowering condition. Yeah, that's the right way to say it. That the mental sense power becomes the empowering condition for the visual sense consciousness, or for the auditory, or for the olfactory, or for the whatever. So that's another metaphor to kind of get at that. Is you can imagine it like that, like a person who goes to these 5 different windows. So the common is the person, meaning the mental, and then the windows would be the uncommon, because it's like it depends on which one you're going to. Oh, sorry, Jody.
So like that metaphor you just gave, I think maybe answered this question, but I kind of look at uncommon as the word unique.
Yeah.
So the common, the mental can support any of our particular or unique senses. Yes?
I completely agree. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think of it. Yeah.
That's what I wrote down.
Yeah, it might be an even easier. I find it easier in some way almost to get it if you think unique empowering condition.
Yeah, that works for me, but I wasn't sure if I was understanding that correctly.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. I mean, I often think of it that way too. I think it's an easier word. Some of the, like, same way I like, for me personally, even though I use object possessor when we're talking, but for myself, I think subject, because it's easier.
Yeah.
For me, that's an easier way to think about it. And the same thing, I think unique is an easier way to think about this than I think they translate Tibetan words literally, which is fine and good, but right. I think, yeah.
Because uncommon kind of implies rare. And it
yeah, somehow special.
Sends you off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think uncommon in this context just means unique. It doesn't mean rare or special or wonderful. Like, yeah, because I would say, oh, you're really, like an uncommon intellect, right? It implies like something very wonderful. But that's not what they're getting at. They're just getting at unique. Yeah, I think is a better way. I guess unique could imply that too. Oh, you're very unique. Anyway, I don't know.
Oh, that's true.
English is funny, but
right, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Or specific. You can almost say it's the specific empowering condition or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Specific.
Sutata. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, my dog just started barking at that moment. I think I'll wait until my dog isn't barking. I'll get back to it. Sorry.
Oh, it's Lynn. Yeah.
I wonder if you can sort of layer this. I was thinking of something that happened this morning. My cat, who's still a kitten, one of them, I sensed that they were near the door. And so I looked at them. I guess that would be an uncommon sense. I looked at the cat. The cat is looking up through the part of the door that she can see and looking at something. So I'm thinking, what is she looking at? And then I hear the birds. So then I look at the birds. Okay, so I guess that's the uncommon perception leading to a visual perception, leading to the direct perception of the birds. But it's like a sort of a circuitous route to get there. Is that what you're talking? That's what we're talking about?
It's really interesting example. I'm very mundane, normal. I mean, it's part of normal life. But yeah, you're really getting it. Like, if you really, this is what you can do if you wanted to really analyze this kind of, use this to analyze one's own perception, right? It's like, there was a moment, as you described, there was a moment of mental consciousness where you intuited the cat might be
doing something.
Right. That, which was, and that mental consciousness was the common empowering condition, right? The common one, right? But then you turned your head or whatever, and your visual sense power served as the uncommon empowering condition. And you had first moment, you had a valid cognizer.
The cat at the door.
Cat at the door, yeah. Then, because I'm sure you kept looking for more than an instant, there was a subsequent cognizer of the cat at the door, right? Then, based on your direct cognition of the cat at the door,
Looking out.
looking up, you had a moment of conceptual consciousness then, right? So that direct perception gave rise to a moment of conceptual consciousness where you thought, because that was a thought, oh, I wonder what she's looking at, or he's looking at, or I wonder what the cat's
She,
looking at
yeah.
up there.
Mhm.
What she's that was conceptual, right? And then that conceptual consciousness served as the common empowering thing for, then you're turning
The
your head or
direct
whatever.
perception, the direct
Another
perception of the sound.
You
Yeah.
get it. Yeah, you totally get it. Yeah. So you can see the complexity actually. And part of what we don't usually do is notice, we don't notice when our direct perception gives rise to a conceptual, which then gives rise to another direct, which then gives rise to another, because then one might think, then whatever, different right might think, oh, how lovely birds, or a person might think, oh no, I don't want the birds there, they're whatever, whatever the person would think, right? Or oh, the cat might kill it, whatever. There are all kinds of thoughts that might happen then. But you see, the point there is that we're constantly going back and forth between direct perception, which is unmediated
Right.
by concepts, and then conceptual knowers. And if you watch your own experience, that becomes really interesting to see how we do that, is one point I would make.
Well, and the other thing I thought is, you talked about this a while ago. Are the mindfulness groups really Buddhism?
Mhm.
And I think how you could sort of colloquially or generally say is, well, I was just mindful of the cat and the birds at that moment. So that could be sort of a general way of seeing that, which is, I think people doing mindfulness, I mean, I've done it, mindfulness practice, would see that experience. But if you go deeper, this is what we're studying now. I mean, that's sort of my connection to that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. One other quick point I'll just make, just to note, just for people in general to notice, is if you do this kind of exercise, noticing when you're in direct perception and mindfully, as Lynn just pointed out, and then when there are also conceptual knowers, I just think it's amazing. Start to notice, just for yourself, right? And this is just everyday, using this teaching to notice everyday experiences, is just to play around with noticing for yourself, right? In your own experience, how powerful your reactions are to your concepts. Like, and how much sometimes emotion, how much what's the word? Afflictive emotions, arise through the power of certain specific concepts, and notice which ones they are, right? And then this is just interesting, I think, from this teaching is to think those concepts aren't, they're not functioning phenomena, right? There is, and then in the sense that they have no power from their own side. They only have power through your mind reacting to that, right? Your mind is a functioning phenomenon, right? And your mind reacts to concepts in certain ways, out of habit, right? And I'm just suggesting to notice, so notice it's just an exercise. If you want to practice this, you put this into practice, is notice your own experience of direct perception, and then notice when you give rise to concepts, what concepts you tend to give rise to, and start to notice which concepts for you have an unusual amount of power over your mind. Does that make sense? Like over your emotions, and it's fascinating. Like that's the practice from this, or that's not the practice, that's a practice from this. But it's a powerful one, and it's disturbing because and you'll start to notice if you do this, I think, at least that's my experience, is that it's like we invest these concepts, which are just concepts, we give them through habit so much power, and then you start to realize, according to this tenet system, those are just conventional truths, right? Meaning they're deceptive, because while they get at a certain phenomena, they're not the phenomena, right? They're just our concept, and anyway, I just want to point that out. So to notice when you're in direct perception, and then when you're in conceptual knowers is one point. But the second point would be to notice which static concepts have power for you, does that make sense? Kind of just as an exercise to play with in life. And actually, I'm being, yeah, I don't know, we should continue on with the text, but I'm just going to be playful for a second. Like, notice the power of concepts. I'm going to try one. Donald Trump. And I use him as I'm only using it because, like, I've noticed everyone has a concept of him that impacts them, right? Or, but you could do it with anything, right? What is your, so like, to notice what's my concept, and and what does that concept do to my mind? And to recognize that concept is not the phenomenon, right? It's my permanent, not in the sense of eternal, but it's static, right? That's my static concept. And one thing Human Kenshiro pointed out is everyone's concepts are different, right? One day I was, like doing a different, like Tsongkhapa, right? Lama Tsongkhapa. Do this one, the Buddha. My point is, you have a concept, right? I say the Buddha, and you have a concept, right? And that's your concept, right? Of Buddha. And how do you react to that concept? And actually, and I'm just pointing out, so we have so many concepts, right? And all I'm trying to point out is to notice, oh wow, what is my concept? How do I react to it? Does it cause me happiness or suffering? And that's powerful, is all I'm trying to point out. And that's incredibly useful. And to notice that's different than a direct perception. And then notice how we mix our direct perceptions and our concepts. And we get them confused. We confuse our concept with the direct perception. And they're not the same, ever. They're never the same thing, right? A concept can get at a functioning phenomena, but it's not the functioning phenomena. And never will be, because it's a concept. Maybe there's still time. So we could, this is quick, so we'll do at least the self-knowing direct perceivers. So we can do that because that's easy. So again, the Sautantrikas do assert self-knowers. There are different Buddhist tenet systems do and don't assert self-knowers, right? Vaibhashikas don't assert them. Sautantrikas do. Mind only following scriptures do assert them, and so on. But with respect to the third, self-knowing direct perceivers, the definition is that which has the definition of a self-knower is that which has the aspect of an apprehender. The definition of a self-knowing perceiver is that which has the aspect of an apprehender, is free from conceptuality, and is non-mistaken. And by the way, so I just want to point this out, a self-knower, remember this, the self-knower is not, I just want to remind everybody, because or if you don't know what to say it, in this context, self-knower is not introspection. And so, a self-knower doesn't mean that you're aware of that you have a deep awareness, or that you're somehow, it has nothing to do, it's also not, sometimes people talk about like the witness, that can see what's going on and detaches from, the flow of thoughts. That's not self-knowing. Whereas in this context, self-knower is just is something that that all, according to this tenet system, is something that all sentient beings have. It's a natural phenomenon, and it's in the same aspect as the perception. So it's like it's just always there. Like when you're perceiving or experiencing things, it has the same aspect as, but it's how your mind remembers the experience. So according to this tenet system, it's just like that you're aware of your experience, or you're aware of your awareness experiencing on some very fundamental way that cats also have, and you know, in other words, they all beings have this, and it's what allows beings to remember. So anyway, so then it gives 3 examples: a valid cognizer that's a self-knower, a subsequent cognizer that's a a valid cognizer that's a self-knowing direct perceiver, a subsequent cognizer that's a self-knowing direct perceiver, and the same thing, an awareness to which an object appears, but is not as ascertained that it's a self-knowing direct perceiver. So the first example of the first is the first moment of a self-knowing direct perceiver that experiences an eye consciousness. And so this is very simple. All this is saying is, like, this is not getting at anything meditative. This is saying, like, I'm going back to my example, when I saw the yellow bird, right? What this is asserting is that on some very simplistic level, I was aware of seeing, while I was seeing a yellow bird, I was aware of seeing a yellow bird, right? And so I can remember that experience, and I can say to you all, oh, I saw a yellow bird the other day. You know, that's all that self-knower is. And so that the first moment of that seeing of a yellow bird was a pramana, a valid cognizer, right? So the self-knower of that valid cognizer is also a valid cognizer. It's a self-knowing valid cognizer. Then the next one, right? And all this is saying is, in the second moment and the third moment and the fourth moment of looking at that yellow bird, those would be, the actual experience of those were subsequent cognizers, not valid cognizers, but subsequent cognizers. So the self-knower that was registering, I'll call it, that experience was a subsequent cognizer that was a self-knowing direct perceiver, right? Because it was directly perceiving my own perception of seeing a yellow bird, and therefore I can remember, oh, I stood there for a few minutes and looked at the yellow bird. It's nothing mystical about that. It's just how we remember, according to this tenet system. And then they give the third is the you know, a self-knower that's aware in regards to an object, let's see, right, that appears but is not ascertained, and it gives examples of those. Self-knowing direct perceiver. And really all they're getting at here, they give different examples, but I'm going to simplify it. What they're getting at is that, in other words, if the mind is absorbed in a certain thing and then it doesn't perceive, so it doesn't apprehend, in other words, it apprehends, but so that something else appears to it, but it doesn't apprehend it. The self-knower that's aware of that would be, you know, actually, I mean, this is giving kind of a little bit esoteric examples, but I'll just give a very simplistic one, right? If I were absorbed, the example I gave before, if I were absorbed in a conversation and I, you know, somebody came along and said something, but I didn't really apprehend I didn't get what they said because I was too absorbed in my conversation, there's still a self-knower, right? I can remember, oh yeah, I was having this conversation and somebody said something, but I didn't really get what they said, right? You know, so that would be the self-knower of that moment, and that would be a direct perception. So that's all. So that's all. So that's getting at, it's just that the self-knower that knows those different kinds of direct perceptions is another category of direct perceiver. That's all it's really getting at here. And the next one, though, is more, I think, is more practically important, which are yogic direct perceivers. And so what is a yogic direct perceiver? Right? A yogic direct perceiver is that which is generated in dependence upon its own uncommon empowering condition, a meditative concentration that is a union of calm abiding and special insight. As is an other knowing, exalted knower in the continuum of a superior that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. So this one's quite important, right? So first of all, like to be a yogic direct perceiver, right? Remember we said uncommon empower. So like with sense direct perceivers, you know, the common empowering condition is the mental sense power, but the uncommon were the 5 sense powers, right? And remember, because empowering condition is not something mystic, right? It means empowering condition means what like allows something to arise, right? So here, what allows a yogic direct perceiver to arise is a union of calm abiding and special insight. And actually, what is that, right? So first of all, we often talk about that as Buddhists, don't we? Shamatha and Vipassana. You know, union of calm abiding and special insight is a union of Shamatha and Vipassana. And actually, what just briefly, yeah, what is that? Right? What is the union of Shamatha and Vipassana, or calm abiding and special insight? So in brief, right, what that is that first one develops calm abiding, right? And what is, I'm just going to, you know, without going into humongous detail, right? There are 9 stages that one goes through. They're taught in Lamrim, and the Sangha teaches them, and the Bodhisattva, and well, actually, in a number of texts, and a Sangha, you know, they're taught in many places. Also, Maitreya's texts teach them, right? But one goes through 9 mental abidings, which are each, what's the word? Have a more deep concentration than the one before, right? Levels of concentration, levels of abiding. And when in cultivating meditative concentration, right, one does that. And eventually one achieves the ability to stay single-pointedly without sinking, like without any mental sinking or mental excitation. One eventually develops this ability to stay single-pointedly on an object for as long as one wants, right? So you could like choose to meditate on a certain object and effortlessly stay concentrated on it for as long as you want to stay concentrated on it. That's not yet calm abiding, though. Then once you get so familiar with that, you there's an experience of mental and physical bliss and pliancy. Pliancy means like, so bliss is bliss, right? Mental bliss and physical bliss. And pliancy means like that your mind is and body are serviceable, they sometimes call it. It means like there comes a point where because of the power of your concentration, your mind and body can engage in virtuous activities without getting tired, without, you know, like actually, you know, we often have the opposite. I'm sure, you know, I sometimes do anyway. I'm sure you guys do too sometimes. Like if you're not, don't have calm abiding, but like you ever have the experience like after a day's work, right, or something, or after working hard on something where you can't focus anymore, right, or your body's just like, oh, I'm just tired. You know, like I can't, you know, you might want to go do something positive, but you can't do it. And if you were to sit down to try to meditate, you'd be like, oh, I'm just too tired. I can't focus. And sometimes it's your mind, and sometimes it's your body, sometimes it's both, right? When you have calm abiding, that doesn't happen. There's the Lama Zopa says your body's like cotton, it's very light, you know, or something, and your mind is very flexible and can focus. So when you develop all of that, you can concentrate as long as you want. You have the experience of physical and mental bliss and this kind of pliancy or flexibility or lightness or serviceability, ability to do what you want. Then you have calm abiding. Then you use that calm abiding to contemplate, right? To do what we're talking about in this text, which is develop valid cognition through reasoning, right? Valid cognizers through reasoning. And at first, when you use the reasoning, your concentration weakens. But there comes a point when you alternate concentration and analysis, concentration and analysis, keep alternating them until eventually, through that process of practice, there comes a point when your contemplation no longer weakens, I'm sorry, when your contemplation, your reasoning no longer weakens your concentration, but actually strengthens it. And then you penetrate the meaning of whatever you're contemplating with a power of mind that's incomparable to what an ordinary person's mind can do, what somebody like our minds can do, right? So you can, not only can you single-pointedly focus, but you can analyze something in a way where it enhances your focus, right? In this calm abiding and this complete absorption into that topic. And that's when you achieve this union of calm abiding and special insight. So it's a very, very powerful kind of mind, right? Anyway, so that kind of mind is the uncommon empowering condition for a yogic direct perceiver. And so, and so what this is getting at here is this, is so a person who has developed that kind of uncommon empowering condition can then, through the power of that, gain insight, right? And so here it says, right, generated dependence upon its own uncommon empowering condition, a meditative concentration that is a union of calm abiding and special insight, is an other knowing exalted knower, right? So it means that just means it's not one of the self knowers, right? It's an other knower, meaning it knows a phenomenon, right? In the continuum of a superior, that means an Arya, somebody who's seen selflessness or emptiness directly, right? Superior here means Arya, so somebody who's seen reality, right? So it's an other knowing exalted knower, exalted because it's seeing the truth, right? In the continuum of an Arya who's seen selflessness directly, that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken, right? And this is where I started today, so it's a good place to kind of, we'll finish up here, right? Such an exalted knower, right? In this tradition, right? It's directly perceiving, as I said earlier, compounded phenomena, like the aggregates, right? And at the same time, it's recognizing non-conceptually the lack of a self, right? So it's sort of it's realizing the lack of a self-sufficient substantial existent self. And I'll just mention the divisions and then we'll stop, right? So the divisions of these, right, are valid cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers and subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers, right? So if you imagine, just like we'll good place to kind of go here, you know, so, and actually, yeah, I'll just remind people, right? So actually, when one develops on the actually there, in terms of the union of calm abiding and special insight, there are many different objects that one can be analyzing, right? Some of them are mundane, like, and that's not this, right? Because this says in the mind of a superior, in an Arya. But like there are, non-Buddhists can develop a union of calm abiding and special insight. An example would be where the special insight is on the faults of the desire realm and how the form realm are better. It's more blissful there. And if a meditator does that, they can take rebirth in the form realm. That's the cause of that, actually, rebirth. But that wouldn't be in the mind of a superior, would it? So in the mind of a superior means here that, so I just want to point out an example would be selflessness, right? So if the yogi, and actually when a yogi first develops the union of calm abiding and special insight, they enter the path of preparation, right? So first comes the path of accumulation, then preparation. So the path of preparation is when the person first develops the union of calm abiding and special insight. And then through habituation to that, they eventually realize the path of seeing. And at the path of seeing, that's when you achieve. I just want to point out. So an example of, this is where I wanted to conclude. An example of a yogic direct perceiver that's a valid cognizer, right, would be the first moment of the path of seeing, when the person first realizes selflessness, right? And they gain a valid cognition of selflessness. That would be an example of a valid cognizer that's a yogic direct perceiver, in that case of selflessness of persons. Now that they say there are 16 moments on the path of seeing. So anyway, the point being, those subsequent moments after the first moment, we validate subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers. It would still be a yogic direct perceiver perceiving selflessness, but it wouldn't be new anymore, right? So after the first moment, so it would be then, those would be subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers. They're still arising through the power, the uncommon empowering condition of the union of calm abiding and special insight. They're still non-mistaken and free of conceptuality, but they're not new anymore at that point. So there will be subsequent cognizers that are realizing that. Anyway, and you see why these are important is actually yogic direct perceivers are how we gain freedom from samsara. Right? You have to have yogic direct perceivers to achieve liberation, which is why we eventually need the union of calm abiding and special insight. So yeah, so I think I'll stop there. In terms of new material, I want to save a minute for a point that Varahi and I were emailing about. But any one last question, or is that maybe one last question before we stop? If there is one or not, it's okay. Right, good. So I just want to suggest this. So first of all, for homework though, and it's not like homework, but I just want to suggest trying out what I was suggesting earlier. So trying out noticing, when am I directly perceiving? When am I perceiving by way of a concept, right? And remember, concepts are static, right? They're called eliminative knowers, right? They're mental images, right? So when am I and try to notice, actually, just for your own experience, when am I having, you can actually notice this, because we all have valid, I want to put this out also, every single day, you are having many, many valid, pramana, like valid sense direct perceivers, right? They're a normal part of experience. Every day you're having also many subsequent, direct perceivers that are subsequent cognizers, right? Where you're just looking at something. It's not something radical. It's not something eminent. It's not something mystical necessarily. Can be. And then when are you knowing by way of a mental image? And if you start to I'm just suggesting this idea because I think it's, otherwise it's just intellectual exercise, which is still good, but it becomes something very useful, which is like, just to start to notice that. Like, and when do I mix together my mental image with a direct perception? And when is my emotional reaction in relation to my mental image? What is my mental image that I'm reacting to? How does it relate to a direct perception? Does it relate to a direct perception? Do I have certain mental images that I've habituated myself to having big emotional reactions to? This is all useful, right? If you want to, for practicing Dharma, right? And so anyway, so that's the exercise that's the homework I want to suggest, is to just practice being aware of that. Our next couple classes are already scheduled, and soon we'll have, Gabe just mentioned, soon we'll have the website back up, so they'll be up there. But I already emailed the next few classes, so we're good for that. And before we stop, though, we also, so Gabe has been fixing the website and creating a new website, actually not fixing it, but creating a whole new website, and that'll be up soon. The other thing that happened, though, I'll do a preface, and then Varahi, if you want to say something, but Venerable Dundrup, who was our previous spiritual program coordinator, a few months ago, he left the area and he's no longer able to keep doing the newsletter, the email. It's just like once a week we send out an email. So Varahi, we were like looking for a volunteer, but Varahi, do you want to kind of comment? You said you had something maybe to say about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a number of us have been filling some of his responsibilities, but the newsletter actually is something we do need a volunteer for. And basically, most of you received it, so you know what it is. It's basically just a letter that goes out once a week with the upcoming events and the weekly classes, and for now with the Zoom links included. But this would be something that would be wonderful for the community, because it's important. As you probably noticed by not receiving it, there's kind of a little bit of a hole there. So if anybody is interested in it, as I said, it's just a once a week, putting down what's coming up and what's ongoing. I'll leave my email here on the chat box, but you can also email Lauren as well. We'd really very much appreciate it, just as a way to give. So thank you. I don't know, Gabe or Lauren, if you want to add anything.
I was emailing with Venerable Dundrup, and yeah, he made it clear he had volunteered to do it, even though he left the area and is sort of working in another center, but now he's just too busy. He said there's so many demands on him at the other center that he couldn't keep up with it. But I don't think, my impression is just, you don't have to type it. I just want to make it clear. It's not whoever volunteers to do it, if we can find a volunteer, it's not, you don't have to write anything. It's just cutting and pasting, basically. You just cut and paste the current program into an email. I guess he has a template that he's willing to kind of show how you cut and paste it and stick it in the template, and then you just hit send. And there's already, it's one of those services that already has like the whole list. So it's not like it's really just cutting and pasting and sort of keeping up with that once a week. So it'd be like, I don't think it takes very long. He didn't tell me. I emailed him to ask how long it takes, but it might be, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. I'm imagining a week is my guess. But yeah, anyway, so if anybody's willing to do that, if you email Varahi or myself or Gabe or something, we can follow up and figure that out. Yeah, and then because that would be great once we have the website back up, and then it's all hit at once. It seems like the website crashed. I thought it was one thing, but it actually was unrelated. That the website crashed at the same time Dundrup got too busy, so all of our communication for the center fell apart in the same month, it seems like. So this should fix it. Once we can get this and the website's back up, everything will be good again. So yeah, if anybody has time, just email, we'll figure that out. But and we should do their dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate through these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. May the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. Achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. And lead all sentient beings to enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks everybody. And I think our next of these classes is in 2 weeks. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, the next class is in 2 weeks, the 12th.
Great class. Thank you.
Thanks.